The book of Genesis is not a science textbook. Trying to harmonize is trying to figure out how Darwinian thought works in the world of Genesis is a fool's errand. Efforts to try and make Genesis speak as if it were speaking with the voice of modern science distorts what it has to say. Theology and science are distinct yet overlapping ways of seeing the world. And they err when they try to speak to things that they're not really equipped to do. More to my point, if we try to understand Genesis, this happens so often, if we try to understand Genesis in terms of modern science, we will miss what it actually has to say to us. First, a little background about Genesis. Genesis is the first book in the Pentateuch, which the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. Tradition has said that the Pentateuch was written by Moses, but this is something the Pentateuch itself does not claim. The idea that Moses may not have been the author of the Pentateuch arose at least as early as the time of the Jewish scholar Spinoza in 1670. Spinoza noticed that Moses is regularly spoken of in the text as he rather than as I. In other words, it seems to be suggesting someone's writing about Moses rather than Moses is actually writing it. Furthermore, the end of Deuteronomy, the last book in the Pentateuch, there's bits that are obviously written after Moses' death, which of course would be a little bit tricky to do if it were actually Moses writing. More recently, close analysis of things such as style, theology, the names that have been used has led to the conclusion that not only is the Pentateuch not written by Moses, is likely not even composed by a single person. In Genesis, there's likely 3 sources, 3 authors, if you will. There are 2 creation stories, both written by different authors, written hundreds of years apart. The one that we heard today was written by what scholars have nicknamed as P, because he reflects a priestly orientation. And the second one, which we're not going to look at, but that's chapters 2 and 3, the story of Adam and Eve, is written by the source that has been nicknamed J, because that source likes to use the Hebrew name Yahweh. So the opening words of this text are very, very well known, probably one of the best known verses in the Bible. We probably know it better, however, from the King James, which we grew up with, or many of us grew up with anyways. In the King James, it has, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void." So what this is saying in the King James is presenting the first line is essentially either the first act of creation, God creates the heavens and the earth, or sort of a summary statement of everything. What's assumed in that is that God is creating everything out of nothing. That's the assumption based on the King James. Now, we heard Annie read from the New Revised Standard, the NRSV today, and you may or may not have noticed, but there's some subtle differences. And this reflects critical understanding of how the Hebrew language works, that the people who wrote the King James just weren't aware of. So instead of describing the first act of creation, or even a summary act of all creation, the NRSV tells us of the conditions of things before creation. So, in the beginning, when, that one little word, when, changes everything, right? In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void. In other words, the text is telling us about the conditions before creation. So before creation, there was this pre-existing void, this pre-existing chaos. Before God's work started, everything was in a state of chaos and disorder, marked by darkness, wild waters, and confusion. And this is the raw stuff, if you will, that God takes up, the clay, if you will, that God picks up to use to fashion creation. And when God creates creation, in the first story anyways, the first chapter, what God is actually doing is pushing back chaos, but interestingly enough, not eliminating chaos. So, against the darkness, the primordial darkness, God creates light. The first actual act of creation is in verse 3, where God says, "Let there be light." That's the first act of creation. And God, through the light, does not destroy the darkness. He separates the darkness. So the darkness gets to keep existing. Now you have darkness and light, and they're separated. And further beyond the reading that Annie read to us, the same thing happens in other aspects of creation. God sees the dangerous, uncontrollable, chaotic waters and creates dry land. And he doesn't destroy the waters, he rather separates the waters from the dry land. So there's this separation that's going on. That's really a big theme in this text. But what this means, which I think is kind of interesting and radical, a new way of thinking about creation, if you will, the second creation story sees the chaos and problems that we face, or at least according to some traditions of reading it, as the primordial sin. Like everything was perfect, and then humans sinned, and then everything wasn't perfect anymore. The first creation story sees imperfection and chaos is built into the fabric of reality. It's built into it. It's not something that was mistakenly entered later. It was just included in the very essence of the way things God created the world. Order has been introduced, but not an order that calls for the elimination of chaos. So you have chaos and order now coexisting. And this shapes, or can shape, if we let it into our imagination, how we see the natural order, how we see the world, how we see the cosmos. But it also, I think, can really help us how we see ourselves too. Both we, individually and community, are creations of God. Furthermore, Paul, writing some 700 years, give or take, later than the writer of Genesis, says, "If anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new." Everything has become new. It's interesting, because when I read this before, I always assumed that what Paul said was, you become new. But that's not what he says. So everything becomes new. When you are in Christ, it's not just you becoming new, it's everything becomes new. And it, of course, includes you, but includes so much more than just you. So we might not be able to create a new heaven and earth, but if Paul is right, we can still make everything new, just by our perspective, our consciousness, our connection to the divine. Now, everything is new when we begin to see dizzying arrays of possibilities where before we only saw the same old, same old. Everything is new when we see strangers as friends, when we see the earth as our sister and the sea as our brother, when we see justice as compassion and compassion as real life possibilities. Something that can be kind of hard to believe in these days of war and destruction. God has not stopped creating. In saying this, what I'm saying is God is continuing to push back chaos. God continues to limit the darkness. And each of us is a microcosm of the universe. And so as this is happening out there, this is also happening within our own lives. We are all a strange combination of chaos and order. We are a strange combination of darkness and light. And sometimes things get out of balance. Sometimes the chaos threatens to overwhelm the light. Sometimes the world is threatened. The chaos of war, which of course we're very well familiar, and this threatens to undo creation itself. Sometimes this can happen in our own lives. Things get disordered, out of balance in our own lives, and that chaos can threaten to overwhelm us individually or our families. Yet God is still there, the light is still there, and God, interestingly, invites us now to become co-creators, to join with God in this exciting act of creation. Now, creation, we're not creating stuff out of nothing, but as God's hands and feet, we with God are now pushing back the chaos. And of course, this is not easy work. This can be very difficult work. But remember, our job is not to destroy the chaos, and that's where we often go wrong. We think that our job is to eliminate the chaos, but it isn't. Our job is to put the chaos in its rightful place, to put things back in balance, where night and day are living in harmony. Sometimes when we see things in our own lives, what we want to do is destroy them, or we see something going on in society we don't like, we want to destroy them. That impulse is probably not going to get you very far. The whole metaphor of war is going to set you against. Whereas what I think this creation story is suggesting is trying to create a new balance is you're not fighting against, you're trying to embrace the things that you don't want to necessarily embrace. Because again, the problem is not the darkness, the problem is the lack of balance between the light and the darkness. So what does this all mean in our regular lives? It's a little theoretical. We all have limitations, we all have imperfections. And if we cannot accept those, we can't come to peace with those in some level, this can turn to self-loathing, which itself can further grow into the loathing of others, because other people like you have limitations and imperfections. And so if you cannot find it in yourself to accept those things, the inevitable outcome is a hatred. But if we remember that according to this first creation story, limitations, imperfections are built into the fabric of reality. So the point isn't to destroy anything. God continues to create with us at his side. God continues to say to us, let there be light. And there is light. And that light is within you. Regardless of what kind of darkness, what other chaos is going on in your life, that light is there, period, along with the darkness. But the light is present. It always is. Jesus, in John's gospel, is said to have said that Jesus is the true light who enlightens everyone who comes into the world. And that includes you. That includes the person right next to you. That includes everybody in this room. That includes everybody. That is the light in the darkness. Let there be light. And there was light. And that light was good. Thanks be to God.